Hello everyone, this video we're going to look at what's called comparative advantage. And with this, we're going to see how two countries decide who exports which good, who imports which good, and who is going to be relatively better at making a certain product. In this section, it's going to go a little bit off of the notes, so a little bit off script, but I think it'll be beneficial. So if you have an extra sheet of paper that's not the notes from class, it might help you out on this section a little bit. So two key phrases that we're going to see here. The first is called comparative advantage. And what this part is saying is that a country can produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than another country. So this means I have to give up fewer of another good than another country does. The other type of advantage that we'll run into is called absolute advantage. And what this means is that a country can produce a good using fewer resources than another country. So absolute advantage basically means I'm outright better at making a certain good, whereas comparative advantage means I have to give up less of another good than you do. So the example in your notes kind of shows a graph. Right, and you have this case of Brazil, the U.S., and just in case it's hard to see, on the on the left we have Brazil, and on the right we have the U.S. And the two goods we have are sugar cane and wheat. And one thing you may notice, this is per acre, so our units are standardized. So if we're thinking about, well, who has the comparative and absolute advantage, we can start with the absolute advantage. In this case, we're looking at sugar and wheat. So for sugar, since everything lines up pretty well, if we look at Brazil, Brazil can make that much sugar by themselves, or in the U.S. can make that much. Brazil makes a lot more sugar than the U.S. can, so our sugar will go to Brazil, right? Because 1 acre makes a lot more sugar than an acre does in the States. Then on the other side, on the wheat side, we're going to see that Brazil doesn't really make that much wheat. And if we scroll down, it goes down to right here before the word wheat, whereas the U.S. makes a lot more wheat, and it scrolls out way here to way after the word wheat. So for absolute advantage, wheat is going to go to the USA. So the other type of advantage we talked about was comparative. And we'll do the same thing. We'll look at it for sugar and for wheat. And for comparative advantage, what I'm going to do is when I'm looking at for sugar, I'm going to see if I give up 1 unit of sugar, how much wheat do I gain? And same thing for the US. If I give up about 1 unit of sugar, how much wheat do I gain? Oops. Make that a little bit nicer. How much wheat do I gain? So for Brazil, we're going to see that we have just this very relatively small gain of wheat, whereas the US has a relatively large gain in wheat. So to produce that last unit of sugar, the US has to give up a lot. Brazil doesn't have to give up that much wheat. So the opportunity cost of wheat for Brazil is a lot lower just because they're not giving up as much. Excuse me. The opportunity cost for sugar for Brazil is a lot lower because that 1 unit of sugar gives them relatively small amount of wheat, whereas the U.S., that 1 unit of sugar gives them a large amount of wheat. So for comparative advantage, sugar will go to Brazil. And for wheat, we'll do the same thing with the U.S. We'll do the same thing. We'll take away 1 unit of wheat, see how much sugar Brazil can get. And for the U.S., same thing. Take away 1 unit of wheat, see how much sugar we can get. Brazil can get a lot of sugar by giving up that 1 unit of wheat, whereas the U.S. gains a relatively small amount of sugar. So U.S. has a lower opportunity cost. So in this case, the comparative advantage goes to the U.S. for wheat. So that's graphically what's going on. The other part of this is going to be more of a table and more of a mathematical side. So the first example I'm going to look at is suppose we have Iowa and South Carolina, and they can produce corn or peaches. Now, when we're reading this graph, what we're saying is that this tells us that Iowa can produce either 10 corn or 2 peaches. Similarly, South Carolina can produce 8 corn or 4 peaches. And this could be per day, per hour, whatever the case is. So when we think about our absolute advantage, we want to know who can make more corn using fewer resources, who can make more peaches using fewer resources, basically who can make more of that good. So in this case, Iowa can produce 10 corn, South Carolina 8 corn. So the absolute advantage for corn is going to go to Iowa. And for peaches, Iowa can produce 2 peaches while South Carolina can produce 4. So South Carolina can produce more. So the absolute advantage is going to go to South Carolina. So, and then to find comparative advantage, we have to find the opportunity cost and pick the country or state in this case that has the lower opportunity cost. And when we talked about opportunity cost, so for corn, we want to know how many peaches does it take to get 1 unit of corn. So what we'll do, like we said earlier in the chapter, take the number of peaches divided by the number of corn that we can produce. And again, that gets corn to, so that we're seeing how many peaches we have to give up for 1 unit of corn. So in this case, our peaches, in Iowa, we can make either 2 peaches or 10 corn. So this will come out to 2 over 10, which comes out to 0.2 peaches. So in order for Iowa to make 1 unit of corn, they have to give up 0.2 of a unit of peach. Whereas for South Carolina, again, we'll take the number of peaches divided by the number of corn. And this will give us 4 peaches or 8 corn. So this will be 4 over 8, which is 1/2, which would be 1/2 of a peach. So in this case, 0.2 is less than 0.5. So Iowa is going to have the comparative advantage in corn. Now for peaches, we have a couple things we can do. We can either keep looking back at the top, or we can note, well, when we do peaches, it's just going to be how much corn do we have to give up for 1 peach. So in this case, all we'll do is we'll take the number of corn divided by the number of peaches. And if you notice and you remember this phrase from algebra, this will be we're going to take the reciprocal of the opportunity cost for corn. So in this case, we have instead of 2 over 10, we'll do 10 over 2, which would be 5 corn. So for Iowa to make 1 peach, we have to give up 5 corn. And same thing for South Carolina. They'll take the number of corn divided by the number of peaches. This will be 8 over 4, which comes out to be 2 corn. And since 2 is less than 5, South Carolina will have the comparative advantage here. And we'll say that South Carolina has the comparative advantage in peaches. So from this, we kind of get 2 takeaways. And I've pre-written these. If you need to, if the video goes a little too quick, you can always pause it here and copy these down if you want. Or in Blackboard, you can find the link to our Class OneNote page. They'll be right off to the right side. So if you're on here, you swipe to the right and you have these. But 2 big takeaways. We're going to say that, 1, if country A has the absolute advantage in good A, and country B has the absolute advantage in the other good, then comparative advantage will follow suit. So country A has the comparative advantage in good A, and country B will have the comparative advantage in good B. Just like in our example up here. So Iowa had the absolute in corn, South Carolina had it in peaches. We saw that Iowa also had the comparative in corn, while South Carolina had the comparative in peaches. The other takeaway that we'll see is that if one country has a comparative advantage in a good, then the other country will always, and this time we mean the word always, have the comparative advantage in the other good. So in this case, we saw Iowa had the comparative advantage in corn. This means that South Carolina will have the comparative advantage in peaches. So another example we might see is a case where maybe one country is better at producing both goods than the other. And we'll see that even in this case, there's going to be benefits to trade. In the next chapter or so, we'll talk about and actually see those gains. But to start out with, right, we're going to have the UK and Italy, and they're going to produce olives and grapes. Now, just for context, both olive and grapes, they grow well in the Mediterranean, and the UK not as well, right? And the United Kingdom isn't well known for its wines or its olive oil, whereas Italy, both olive oil and olives and wine and grapes are a bigger part of their culture and a part of their cuisine. So in this case, when we think about our absolute advantage, for olives, we see Italy can produce 4 olives, while UK can produce 1. So our absolute advantage will go to Italy in this case. And same thing for grapes. Italy can produce 12 grapes, while UK can only produce 2. So again, the grapes will go to Italy. So in this example, this first takeaway is not applicable to us because the same one country has the absolute advantage in both goods. So to find our comparative advantage, we actually have to do a little bit of work. So this first part asks for the comparative advantage. So we want to find the opportunity cost for olives. This means that we want to see how many grapes do we have to give up to make an olive. And for this, we see that in the UK, right, we're starting with UK, we can have either 2 grapes or 1 olive. So we would do 2 over 1. So our opportunity cost for an olive would be 2 grapes. Then for Italy, we'll do the same thing. The number of grapes divided by the number of olives. And this is going to be, in their case, 12 grapes or 4 olives. So 12 over 4. And this is going to give us 3 grapes. So in this example, 2 is less than 3. So we'll see that UK will have the comparative advantage in olives. We can write that down right there. So given that UK has a comparative advantage, we're going to know that Italy will have the comparative advantage in grapes. So before we do any math, we can write down already that Italy has the comparative advantage in grapes. But just to show it, we'll work through it really quick. So the UK, they would take the number of olives divided by the number of grapes to find the opportunity cost for grapes, which for them would be 1 over 2, which would be a half of an olive. Oops, I can write that a little bit neater for you. And on the other side, Italy, again, they'll do the number of olives over the number of grapes. And for them, that'll come out to 4 over 12, which is 1/3, which is 0.33. And again, that'll be 0.33 olives. And again, 0.33 is less than 1/2. So like we expected, Italy has the comparative advantage in grapes. As we go through, we'll see that this going more in depth with comparative and absolute advantage is going to be useful. I hope this is interesting. And always, if you have any questions or issues, feel free to let me know.